Back in 1969, President Richard Nixon proposed to cut federal funding for public broadcasting from $20 million down to $10 million. Slash it right in half. But who could speak out against these cuts better than Fred Rogers? His show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, had begun airing nationally just 1 year before, but he'd already been working in public television for more than 10 years. He knew how vital it was as a medium to reach children. So, on May 1st, 1969, he testified before the Senate Committee on Commerce Subcommittee on Communications, which was chaired by Rhode Island Senator John Pastor. The recording of his testimony has been passed around online for years. I first saw it probably 15 years ago or so, and it still kills me.
And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. I'm constantly concerned about what our children are seeing. And for 15 years, I have tried in this country and Canada to present what I feel is a meaningful expression of care.
When Rogers starts to speak, the committee chairman looks annoyed and skeptical.
All right, Rogers, you got the floor.
But after just 6 minutes, he changes completely.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
It turns out that this kind of data is actually kind of hard to track down, but according to some solid polling in 2017, kids 8 and younger typically spend 2 hours and 19 minutes a day interacting with screens, most of that being watching TV or other video content. And that number isn't exactly important for my point, which is just that kids are watching TV. It's a medium they're comfortable with. So should we care about what they're seeing? Fred Rogers sure thought so. He saw this as a powerful medium that could help kids from many different backgrounds learn how to navigate the complicated world we all live in. He and others have led the charge, developing programming that empowers kids and instills in them deep moral values. And it's not just children's media. We're all learning how to navigate the world through the media we engage with. So maybe we should try to figure out what those lessons are that we're getting from media. You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how they change. I'm Andy Luttrell, and this week I'm excited to share my conversation with Lindsay Hahn. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University at Buffalo, and she studies how media influence people throughout their lifetimes. In particular, we talk about her work looking at how children's entertainment conveys messages that guide kids' moral development. But we'll also see how moral lessons show up in all sorts of media. A quick heads up, though, before we get into things. You'll hear us keep referring to something called the mime throughout our conversation, but in hindsight, we never quite stop to make sure you know what we're talking about. So, the mime, M-I-M-E, stands for the Model of Intuitive Morality and Exemplars. It's an idea pioneered by communication scholar Ron Tamburini. Lindsay does a great job walking us through its finer points, but it's basically an attempt to make sense of the role of morality in our media landscape, including the influence of everyday media consumers and the people who make that media content. So now you know, the mime is not a scary, quiet clown. In this case, anyway. It's just a good old social science model. And with that, let's talk to Lindsay Hahn. Is that, what's your background, by the way? Is that...
It's in communication. So, my PhD is in communication and even my undergraduate as well. So I hopped around as different majors as whenever I was an undergraduate and eventually settled on communication because I was really interested in media effects. So it's kind of what led me here. But yeah.
Gotcha. So Was the moral motivation, so you said you're interested in media studies, was the moral motivations part of it always curious, or that was something that you discovered once you
Well,
got
so I
dropped?
have an interesting story, I think, kind of about how I got into that too. Do
Okay,
you want me
great.
to save it? Or I guess
Let's
if
do
we're,
it. Yeah.
okay. So I became really interested in media effects whenever I was an undergraduate, mostly because I was really interested and annoyed. This is where all great research comes from, right? What we're annoyed from. But I was really annoyed that I watched a lot of TV. I played a ton of video games, and people used to tell me like, "Oh, they're rotting your brain. They're so bad for you." And I'm like, "Are they really though? Like plenty of people are just like completely functioning adults, and they do this stuff as well." So that's kind of where my research interest in media effects started. And I became really interested in trying to understand, like, are media actually bad for us? Like, is binge watching actually bad for us? Is it bad to play violent video games? I loved playing Mortal Kombat. Is that actually bad for us? And so when I got to graduate school, I was like, how can we actually study this stuff and try to understand, like, from an empirical standpoint? And it turns out that most of the research in this area already, it's a widely, hugely studied area. Most of the research in this area already has been looking at what they call pro-social media and pro-social media effects, anti-social media effects. And I was never really satisfied with those terms because everybody uses them to mean different things. They're not well defined. Sometimes people talk about pro-social as being this general altruism. Sometimes people talk about pro-social as being specifically helping. And oftentimes what happens, we've noticed, is that people, when they bring up pro-social and anti-social media content or effects, they start talking about examples of behaviors that will fall into those. So examples of behaviors that characters could do in a narrative, for instance, that would constitute pro-social, and then types of effects that we might see in audiences as a result. So, if you watch, I always give this example, but I think I can't use this example anymore because nobody knows it. Power Rangers.
Oh, sure.
When I was growing up.
Absolutely.
I use this with my undergraduates, and they're like, huh, what? No. Power Rangers was huge because, I remember that whenever I was growing up, we used to watch Power Rangers, and then it was common to fight your siblings, right? In the same way that the Power Rangers fought the baddies, whoever they were at the time. And so those would usually get classified as anti-social media. But, in general, they're still sort of kind of, fighting good versus evil.
They're saving the world.
Exactly. Isn't that kind of a good thing? So anyway, that's my long-winded way of saying we sparked this sort of this research program in trying to really kind of understand what is pro-social media and what is actually going on in the content that makes people classify it as good versus bad, and then looking at the effects as well. And so that's kind of where my research kind of landed. I do media psychology research, but I focus on what's actually going on in the content. We need to understand that if we're going to understand what types of effects it could produce, but then also what types of effects might be spurred by media. Are we actually getting affected by media and replicating behaviors or coming up with new behaviors that we hadn't thought of before we saw, a particular behavior in a media context? Or is it the case that media aren't really affecting us at all?
I think we can zoom out a little bit further even to ask, like, what is media? I feel like a lot of this term, the media, has gotten so popular, but it's like, it doesn't refer to all media, right? Yeah. Even though it sounds like it does. So as a media effects researcher, like, what do you mean when you say media do this or that?
Generally, whenever I'm referring to it, let me back up actually, because in my initial kind of grad school days and even most of my initial research, I was focusing on what we call traditional or like legacy media. So these are basically any type of media, it could be movies, it could be video games, anything that you're sort of consuming for entertainment purposes, not social purposes. So entertainment or really informational purposes. So you can think about news media as kind of falling into that category as well. I've done a little bit of work with social media. But often, too, it's worth mentioning that many of the same kind of moral panics that we're talking about with legacy media, is television rotting our brains, is are video games bad for us? They still apply to social media. Of course, we all hear this now, right? That social media are sort of ruining our kids and they're causing mental health problems. I will say that I think the effects are different depending on the particular use of media that people are engaging with. But nevertheless, we tend to use it in terms of entertainment and news, information-seeking purposes.
So it can be all sorts of things. I mean, in looking at the sorts of media that you do work in, right? It's entertainment and music also. Like you would say music is a form of media too?
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay, so we teased this idea of the mime, but maybe let's unpack it. I'm going to make you temporary spokesperson for this model, and help us understand, like, what is the core premise or insight of this model? Like, how do media convey to us information about, why we should do what we do?
Yeah, so the MIME was sort of created as a way to kind of synthesize a lot of existing research that had kind of formalized different processes on sort of, this will, I guess, I'll explain this in a minute, but micro level processes and sort of macro level processes. There were all these different, models out there that kind of specify these processes, but nobody really kind of looked at them together. And so the MIME was developed as a way to kind of pull them all together and say, like, could we actually come up with a comprehensive model of what we think happens whenever people consume moral media. And the reason that they focus on moral media is because, again, people have been concerned about the effects of these types of entertainment media forever. The MIME doesn't just apply to entertainment media, but historically that's where most people have applied it. It's been around since about 2011-ish. And so the basic idea, if I can kind of take you through the steps here, and the micro level side is that as audiences, we're exposed to some type of moral exemplar in the media, just an example of morality. So this could be something as simple as, a Power Ranger fighting off a bad person, right? So maybe like a fighting move, or it could be something, moral, like, I'm watching a character help another character. Doesn't have to be entertainment, could also be news, as I mentioned. If you're reading about, the classic example we always give is if you read a news story about people who are harmed from a hurricane and the sort of aid that's going to them to try to help them, kind of an exemplar of some type of moral value that kind of stirs up in your emotions, or stirs up some sort of value in you that we should help people. So when we consume media that feature moral exemplars, we generally place more importance on those moral values, whatever it is that we've consumed. So be it, helping, be it fairness or loyalty, if we're sticking with moral foundations theory typology. When we tend to consume more and more media over time that features those same exemplars, we tend to place more importance on those types of values. And when we place more importance on those values, we generally then go seek out media that, again, contains those values. So the classic example I always give here is that lots of people are sort of true crime fans, right? Most of the time, for lots of the true crime media that kind of exist out there, and not even true crime, but sort of fictional crime like Law and Order, SVU type people, usually what happens is that it ends in sort of procedural justice, right? The bad guy gets what he deserves. So we consume more of that media, and as we consume more of that media, it strengthens within us this value that we place on whatever moral exemplar that we saw. As we continue to repeatedly select media content that contains those moral values, we're entering the kind of macro level media processes here. The idea is that producers and creators take note of audiences' selection patterns, and they end up producing even more content that contains those moral exemplars, which kind of completes the circular loop and feeds more of those exact same moral exemplars back into audiences' media environments. So that's sort of the big picture of the MIME. Nobody that I know has really tested all parts at once, but lots of individual pieces have been tested.
So to me, one of the critical things that's hard to test probably is the influence it has on people, right? That my media consumption shapes the priorities I place on different moral values, right? That's what the MIME predicts, right? If I find myself watching a bunch of, hospital dramas that prioritize care and compassion and helping other people, I become a person who sort of uses that moral value of care and compassion as my guiding compass, right? That's the prediction, right? Do we have what evidence do we have that media actually affects me, that what I watch matters?
Believe it or not, this is actually, I would probably venture to say, the most tested path in the MIME, because it's sort of the most, I would say, proximal, right? It's sort of those temporary effects that we would potentially see in a lab. And so there have been lots of studies in this area that show evidence that it does increase the value that you place on a particular moral value. How long do those effects last? We don't really have a good answer for that. There has been a couple longitudinal studies where they show soap operas to college students for a week, and then see after a week, is there sort of a more enduring type of moral value change, and there is. But again, how long does that last? We don't actually know that the answer to that question, to how sustainable is that change.
So these studies will like randomly assign people to watch one kind of media or another and then gauge like how important different values are to them.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So, and the way that they've measured, how important our moral values kind of varies. In the past, people have used the Moral Foundations questionnaire, but knowing that, the Moral Foundations questionnaire has some reliability shakiness, and in addition, it does not really access this sort of state level kind of importance that people might place on it. It's really more of kind of like a trait measure in some degrees. So there's been some other measures. I know one team is working on like a lexical decision task that's trying to kind of bring in, could we actually assess, moral values importance or salience through that? And they've also tried to measure it using affect misattribution procedures, which in general are this thing where you are kind of flashed a ambiguous character like a Chinese character if you don't speak Chinese on the screen for a really short period of time. You're told that you are supposed to judge that character as either pleasant or unpleasant, and right before you see that ambiguous character, you are flashed a moral word. It might be care, it might be fairness, or it could be a violation of any of those. You're told not to let that word bias your judgment of the ambiguous character, but of course it does. And so it can kind of be, by measuring reaction time, a measure of how kind of intuitively salient or intuitively accessible a moral value might be.
So this line of work is compelling evidence that media shapes my morality, but it's sort of there's a other side of that coin where I carry with me my own priorities. And when I turn the TV on, I get to choose. No one in my life makes me, pretty much, makes me watch one thing or another. And I know this is kind of a long-standing topic of research in communication. It's like, do media shape the public's perceptions, or do public perceptions constrain like what media decides to reflect back to them? And it seems like both of those get accounted for a little bit in the MIME. So could you speak a little bit to, like, are people disproportionately seeking out media that align with the values they already have?
It's a really good question. And the answer is it depends, as all good social science research. So some research suggests, yes, there's this really strong effect that people will select media. And one of the ways that people have looked at this in the past is through soap operas, right? Because with soap operas, I know that I feel like nobody watches them, but it turns out there's still like this whole like fan base of soap operas. So I don't want to make them mad. Lots of people still watch soap operas. Though they tend to have the sort of same moral values shown in them, right? It's all about fairness. It's all about like, you harmed me and now I'm going to harm you back, and revenge sort of things. And so when you look at like selection patterns of these types of soap operas, you do see this sort of effect. But again, it's observational. So, kind of bringing this stuff into the lab to actually look at selection is much more difficult. And in the lab, you do find sort of more mixed effects in terms of like, what are people more likely to select? Because you're exactly right. When you're sort of looking at the vast array of all media content, when you sit down on the couch in the evening to decide what to watch on Netflix or Hulu or whatever, there's so much stuff out there. And so how do you decide what to watch? And even if you do decide what to watch, is it actually being driven by your moral preferences, or is it being driven by kind of your sort of I don't know, how depleted do you feel, right? In that given moment. And so it's tough. I will say we've tried to test the MIME's long-term processes in one study where we content analyzed the entire population of Disney films, which was really fun. We looked at Disney because we thought that if we're able to see producers responding to audience preferences, Disney would be the way to do it, because they've been around forever, since the 1930s, and when they were starting to produce Snow White until now, and they're still having these Disney movies that people still flock to see. And so we did this study where we tried to look at, do box office numbers predict in the future how many films are produced with that moral value, Or is it the opposite? Is it that how many films there are with that moral value now predict future box office numbers? And we didn't really find great evidence of either of those processes, which is frustrating because you would kind of think that at the very least, the sort of profit-driven company is of course going to be, producing whatever they think their audiences want to see. And we kind of reasoned that our findings probably just indicate that Disney has just been stable over time. They're not changing, right? Like they kind of found what works with Snow White and they just stuck with it for, 100 years. And so it's a little bit difficult to test, I think, in the kind of bigger media system.
So in that, do you find that the moral values in these films change at all over time? Or the evidence is that like, these are always about this or whatever?
Yeah, they're stable. They just don't change. And so we make some recommendations in that one particular paper about like if somebody was actually going to try to give this another try to test this, and this study was a lot of work, we recommend trying to look at maybe something like political media, where we talk about the mind identifies these things called morality subcultures, which is basically a subgroup of audiences who kind of select the same media. They have shared patterns of moral salience. They value the same moral values and so on. And so you could imagine, for instance, if you looked at like political media, maybe conservative media versus liberal media, if you were looking at, something like the Ben Shapiro show and audience and comparing that and looking to see whether audience numbers predict what he focuses on in his show versus like, Last Week Tonight or Bill Maher or something like that, to see whether or not the content producers are actually responding to audience preferences, or if audience preferences are sort of the effect here. But we haven't yet tested that. It would be a good place for somebody else to start.
It seems too that like the box office numbers may not be a clean indicator that like people responded to the moral, like there's a million things that go into box office numbers. And so it might have just been like a fuzzy indication, whereas it would be cool. All we have to do is just start like the annual survey of childhood morality and do that for 60 years and then track public opinion changes with changes in what's represented in these movies. That would be very cool.
And I will say we actually started, I became really interested in children's media, quite honestly, from a pragmatic perspective, because studying this stuff in adults is really tough because we all have really, extensive media experiences and we have weird media tastes, right? We all like different things for different reasons and some things we like are just weird. But with kids, they're sort of new to media, right? Like they're not really exposed to lots of stuff. And so we thought that examining some of these processes in kids would be a lot easier. But we get another wrench thrown in the processes here because kids usually aren't the ones selecting their own media, right? They're not the ones paying for the $70 to go see a movie. It's the parents. And so looking at the selection patterns in kids is difficult. Looking at some of the more micro processes in kids is a little bit easier.
It kind of goes back to, I said, people don't choose what I watch, but like for kids, that's the case. And some of the work that you do looking at gender kind of is about that. Like, there might be biases in what the adults in the room are showing you, and that could be impactful to the extent that they're picking up on media that convey different moral priorities, right? So like, I guess we'll just jump into it. Like, are we disproportionately showing young boys media that emphasize certain moral priorities that are different from the priorities that are communicated in media that are chosen for young girls? And this raises like the giant question of like, how do you do this? And the fact that you've done this many content analyses just blows my mind. So I want to talk a little bit about like, what are the mechanics of doing this, right? Like as a psychologist, I know how to survey people, right? I get a representative sample of people from the world. I ask them questions and I gauge like, what is the state of people's opinions on this matter? Whereas you're doing kind of that, but without people, you're doing it with media, right? Like I'm surveying a representative sample of the things that show up on TV sets and figuring out like, what is the common message there? So how do you do that? Pick your favorite, the Disney one or whatever one comes to mind. And just like mechanically, what do you do to like take a census of media?
Yeah, well, I will say too, to just back up a second, Like, again, all good research, this line of work in our content analytic work was largely driven out of the fact that I was annoyed that previous research in media psychology doesn't look at media. They look at the effects of media, but we've no idea what's going on in our media content, which is frustrating for somebody who wants to know what are the effects of it, right? Because we got to know what's doing the affecting in the first place. And so that sparked my interest in content analysis and as a methodology. Because I think, quite honestly, for those of us who investigate messages, whether or not it's entertainment media or not, but if we're interested in messages, we've got to understand what's actually going on in the messages themselves. And so we tend to usually use undergraduates and master students as human coders. We tend to take an approach in using human coders rather than computational approaches, although we've done some of that as well. And the way that we do it is we subject them to training. So we train them on whatever types of content it is that we're interested in. We give them example content where they practice each week. We give them homework each week where they take in, how to understand what is helping behavior in media content, for instance, in Disney films, for instance. And then we look at the end of their training to see whether or not they all agree and can they apply the coding manual reliably. If they can, we move on to the next phase where they're actually coding the content. And when I say coding content, I mean simply extracting what moral values are represented in content. And so yeah, we've done this through all different types of media. We've looked at music, children's and adults' music, to try to understand what the landscape of that is. This is probably not surprising, and we probably didn't need to do a study to find this, but it turns out that it's all about love and relatedness, whether it's platonic or romantic love, both in kids' songs and in adult songs. We've looked at children's books as well to see what kind of moral values are represented in books. We've done a lot of work with television because that's sort of the medium that children, at least historically, have kind of most gravitated toward. And we've looked at movies like Disney as well. And so, and we've looked at things like newspapers and news media as well. But in the entertainment side, the idea here is really just to understand, again, getting back to that kind of core question that drove my initial research interest is people talk about kids media as being very pro-social, but what is that? What does that actually mean? So one of my favorite studies that we've done in this area is to look to see to what extent are moral values presented very clearly in television that's targeted at children. And so what we find is that in television that's targeted at really young children, or that's, I guess it's really that it's television that's popular among children in a really young age group. So these are TV shows like Yo Gabba Gabba. If you've ever watched that, it has no plot whatsoever. Sort of people running around, not even people sometimes. But anyway, when there are moral values presented in those types of television shows, they're usually reinforced. They're praised for doing some moral behavior. When we move up to the next age group, television that's popular among the next age group, it gets a little bit more murky. Sometimes they're rewarded for being moral and punished for being immoral, but not always. And when we get into like teenage media, the moral clarity goes completely out the window. And oftentimes it's the case that we're getting these really complex moral conflicts. People will be very moral, but then they'll be punished for it, or they'll be very immoral, but they'll be rewarded for it. Kind of a fun study.
So young kids, like Mr. Rogers doesn't mince words. He goes like, this is like, don't lie to people and like, be nice to people. And you're like, got it. Thank you, Fred.
Exactly. Yeah. So
message received.
Everybody's very happy about it. Exactly.
Right. But in more complex media, you go like, well, we're just kind of depicting moral dilemmas, and you might make the wrong call, or you might, the good guys don't always win, and the bad guys might sometimes win. And that is morally unclear. You go like, so who am I supposed to be? Is the idea, I mean, just thinking about it right now, like, hopefully these teenagers had the foundation of Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street so that they're not like lost in the moral complications of Glee. I think I saw Glee was one of your shows there, where you're like, God, I don't know what to think. You go, well, I'm sophisticated enough in my moral thinking to be able to track this and not get confused. But when you're 3, you go like, given a trolley problem to a 3-year-old, they're like, so, but what's the good answer? Like, you didn't give me any of the tools.
Exactly. Should I pull the lever? I don't know.
So mechanically though, like you're truly asking college students to sit there and watch 5 episodes of Yo Gabba Gabba very closely, right? Like that's the research, right? Like we randomly plucked 5 episodes or whatever of the entire history of this show, and you're going to sit there and you're going to demarcate scene by scene who's doing what, whether a moral value is being communicated. Like, what does this code book look like? Like fast train me as a coder in this study.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example in the stuff that we've done with moral foundations theory, because I think your listeners are probably familiar with that. I know you've had a couple people on here talking about it before, which is fantastic to listen to, by the way. But yeah, so if we're taking the moral foundations theory approach, for instance, we have each of the 5 foundations: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity, sort of laid out with a very clear operational definition that would say something like, care is, it requires 2 things. It requires one entity who is in need of something and one entity that is responding to that entity's need. If you're coding care, you have to code the person who is responding to the entity's need. Somebody who needs something. They need money on the street. They need, a pat on the back. They need a hug. That's not usually a moral exemplar. Because again, most of the time we're kind of coding moral motivation, so like motivation to benefit or to provide detriment to somebody. And so if you're responding to someone's need, how you respond to that is now a moral issue. And so we can either code it for upholding care if they respond to the person's need, or if they're indifferent or are cruel to the person and create a new need in a person, by punching them in the face or something very harmful, then we would code that as a care violation. And so we have examples along with each of those individual foundations as well. And so in general, people tend to pick up on it pretty quickly. I would say that there has been some research that I was a part of that also suggests that the more training you do, the less reliable your coders get. And so we found generally, I think we've kind of found the sweet spot is generally around like covering like 1 foundation per week. And then in the 6th week, kind of doing them all together, doing a reliability check and sort of moving on. Any more than that, and the research kind of suggests that you've kind of reached a critical mass. You're not going to get any improvement in reliability here.
And it might even be distracting. It's reminding me of the the classic jam tasting studies. I don't know if you know those, where like the experts are the ones who get bamboozled by this because they're like overthinking it. Whereas you're like, hey, random person, which jelly is better? And they go, well, that one's better. But experts go like, oh, well, I don't know. I got to factor in every conceivable thing. And they stray from what is right. So
exactly.
But you're doing this like for so many hours of television. And so I'm curious, like, how long does it take your lab to have some pretty definitive comment on the state of children's television, from like starting that coding to having the numbers at the end?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we usually try to cram it into 1 semester because typically, if we're using undergraduates to be our human coders, they're with us for 1 semester, and they always say they'll come back a 2nd semester. But after we subject them to hours of yoga together, they don't always come back. And so we usually try to keep this in with 1 semester. And so again, we spend usually the first 6-7 weeks on the training and kind of the polishing process, and making sure that everybody agrees, revising the code book if we need to, and then the rest of the semester is kind of spent while they're on their own after they've passed the reliability check, sort of coding on their own. And so that does limit kind of how many things we're able to code, right? The Disney population one, and we spent longer on. That was a whole 2 semesters worth of work. But generally, we're kind of constrained and only looking at content that we know we can get done in 1 semester.
And you mentioned that there's an advantage of having real people do this work, because you could say like, hey, let's just ask ChatGPT, like, do Disney movies, are they like morally virtuous, or like, what's the deal there? Like, what are the limits of using computational approaches to churn through? Because it would be nice to just set a computer program down the path of crunching every conceivable minute of television and giving us an answer. But where is that likely to fall short?
Yeah, well, I'll say this is an ongoing debate, right? There's benefits to human coding. There's cons of human coding. There's benefits to computational or automated coding, and there's cons to it as well. I will say that there's excellent work that is by Freddie Hopp and Renee Weber, who are trying really hard to kind of solve some of these problems that we see, and who are the ones that sort of identified the fact that coders kind of own moral salience can kind of sometimes, and their own demographics can sometimes bias their codes, which is a very real problem in using human coders. But what we tend to find is that in a lot of the content that we're interested in looking at, like, video and live television and movies and even video games. We've done some work, although it's not published, but some work looking at moral decisions in video games as well, is that we really just can't apply ChatGPT or Freddie Hop created the Extended Moral Foundations Dictionary, which is just a fantastic tool. I highly recommend anybody use it. But we can't use that on these types of media. And so I'm hoping that eventually one day there will be some type of tool that somebody smarter than me comes up with that we can use to apply to this stuff. But unfortunately, right now it's just not. And so you're sort of limited to text, right? And there's still lots of awesome things you could do with text. But for instance, in the Disney study, we were really interested in kind of understanding what are the values that the main characters are motivated by. And so we actually tried using some of these automated procedures on Disney Wikipedia plots, because we all know people, I know it used to be the case that we said, don't use Wikipedia for anything, right? And we tell our students that, but it turns out Wikipedia is actually a pretty reliable source of information. They're quite valid as well. Because people, especially Disney fans, are very, very serious about, whether or not their films are being their favorite films are being portrayed correctly. And so we tried applying some of these automated procedures to the Disney Wikipedia plots. But what ends up happening is that the automated procedures will pick up words in the Wikipedia plot that have nothing to do with the main character's motivations. We tried to distill it down so that we only get, sentences that involve the main character. But even then, it's difficult because one of the movies that sticks out in my mind is one of these like sports films. I think it was like a boxing film. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was a Disney film. And because there was a lot of fighting in the film and the main character was constantly involved in fights, but that really didn't have anything to do with his main motivation. His main motivation was to be competent and to win the fights. The Extended Moral Foundations Dictionary would pick up a lot of care words. And so it would look like it's really a care movie, but it's kind of really not, right? Even though there's a lot of fighting scenes in it. So parsing this out and kind of walking that line between what's valid versus what's reliable and what sacrifices in validity are you willing to make to improve reliability, or what sacrifices are you willing to make with reliability so that you can improve validity, it's tough, right?
So having done the work and doing it the right way, where you can get to those sort of, because it strikes me that the other thing is some of it is going to be just purely visual, right? Like it's how these characters are relating to one another beyond just what they're saying to each other, right? So you've got this information. What's your sum up? Like, what is the state of morality in children's media? Like, you've done plenty of these. Do you have kind of like this is the state of the science, here's what we know about children's media and morality?
Yeah, what we know in general is that morality is everywhere. Everything is moral in kids' media. It changes. It depends on what specific type of media and what specific age group you're looking at, but it's everywhere. And perhaps that's not surprising to parents who are watching these things with their kids. But there's all kinds of morality that's imbued in children's media. Children are constantly being told what's right versus what's wrong. You should act like this. You shouldn't act like that. And we like to think that for little people, that must be really difficult. It's already a difficult world to navigate, but you're constantly being told this is good, this is bad. And then you go in another context and it might be, no, that's bad. This is good. So it's tough. And what does that mean about what kids are taking away from media? Also tough to say. We've done some work trying to understand whether or not kids can extract moral values from media content. Now that we sort of know the state is that everything is moral, and it's moral in different ways, in nuanced ways. And generally what we find is that early adolescents can extract moral values from media content. They do understand the moral of the story, right? Whether or not that is kind of influencing their behaviors and influencing especially their long-term behaviors and their long-term kind of social persona. Still, more work needs to be done, I guess.
On that front, on that new work, I was curious. There's an argument to be made that it's easier to extract a moral lesson from media than other kinds of lessons, right? Like, I can more easily watch a soap opera, if we're stick on that, and extract like the moral lessons about what it means to be a good person. I watch a science documentary. It's a little tougher for me to like come away with like a more nuanced sense of the universe. Is there any sense that that's true, that like people are especially adept at tracking the moral progression of a TV show than they are other aspects of the plot?
It's a good question. For kids, I guess I have to say I'm not sure. There might be research out there that suggests that. I'm really not sure. I would anticipate that is correct, though, mostly because we know the way that generally audiences consume entertainment content is to kind of be what the research generally refers to as constant moral monitors. We are constantly monitoring every character's behavior for an inkling of who might be a good person, who do we want to root for, who might be a bad person, who do we want to root against. And that sort of change, that helps us form character dispositions, and ultimately kind of is the fuel that provides either our entertainment or our displeasure with the entire show. So I would say that's probably accurate.
Mm-hmm. And I don't plan to ask my 2-year-old to play Mortal Kombat anytime soon, but should I be concerned? Like,
Did you ask them to play Mortal Kombat?
well, if she wants to, I will be supportive, but I'm not going to go, hey, you got to do this. But I mean, this conversation opened up with like, this was the inspiration. Like, there's a moral panic every decade around children's media and what it's doing to them. And so I'm just curious to get your take. Like, should we be concerned? Like, is this like a important route through which kids learn about what's right and wrong?
I think it is an important route through which kids learn about right and wrong and what behaviors they should enact and what behaviors they shouldn't. And the easiest example of that actually doesn't have to come from science. It comes from just being around kids themselves, because you know that if they learn that kicking is a thing, well, now they want to kick everything, right? And so I think that it's a tough it depends situation, because oftentimes the moral panic around this topic gets really wrapped up into everything is bad and I have to protect my kid and I have to only show them content that upholds moral values. But that's really tough too, because if you're only showing them content that features this extremely morally clear example of you should always help people no matter what the cost is, you should always obey your parents and your leaders and your teachers no matter what the cost is, that's tough. Because what if they're eventually they will be not what if, but they will be presented some moral dilemma in their real life, and they need to know how to kind of weigh the pros and cons of what value to uphold and what value to not uphold. And so generally when people ask me this question, I get asked this question all the time, I say that it turns out that the current state of children's media is kind of complex, but that's actually, I would argue, kind of useful for kind of making well-rounded people who can weigh the pros and cons of these moral dilemmas. Maybe not a trolley dilemma necessarily, but do you let your friend cut in line whenever you know that they shouldn't be allowed to cut in line? Do you value group loyalty over fairness? Well, it really depends, right?
If I could make this personal for a second, I mean, you're gearing up to bring a kid into the world. If we can say that, like, this has to weigh on you at least a little bit. Like, having spent all this time truly like engaging in kids media, like you've probably watched more Sesame Street than I have at this point, and my kid's been watching it for 2 years. Like, I'm just curious, like, does it affect the way you think about like how you're going to navigate this new challenge in your own life?
It does. And I will say, related to this, usually the panic that you hear over media for kids right now is mostly involving screen time. Is screen time bad for kids? What do we do about screen time? And as a media psychologist, this argument always bugs me, because simply being exposed to a screen, except for very, very young infants, it shows that, they sort of get attentional benefits out of it, anyway, attentional stimulation out of it. But really, screen time is not the conversation that I think people and parents really are interested in. That's sort of where it kind of stops. It's at the surface level conversation, but it's really a content question, right? Like, screen time isn't really going to influence your children's behavior, but the content very well could. Now, I will say, anybody who is listening, and Andy, too, as somebody who does laboratory work, we know that we should expect, our theory tells us we should expect this very clear relationship between X and Y. It's never that easy, right? There's so many different influences that are influencing what we get out of something, that I think that it's unreasonable to expect that the consumption of any media content is going to fundamentally alter our behavior forever. And so I think that that is kind of guiding my thoughts about kind of how to navigate once my little one is here. That kids are pretty resilient, and they're gonna watch the same movie 100 times, but they also get something different out of it every time, right? Maybe they focus on one character's behavior with another character this time. Next time they focus on the awesome song that they won't stop singing, right? So every time they kind of get something new out of it. And so again, I think that it's worth keeping in mind that nothing that we do is going to fundamentally alter them when it comes to media. Now, I will say, there is some research that suggests that that you can sort of get these types of flashbulb memories from media experiences that are particularly traumatic or particularly emotional. So, for instance, lots of people remember where they were when September 11th happened, and when COVID news started coming out. Those are a little bit different. So, again, that's kind of out of the entertainment realm. So, I did just want to qualify what I said here a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say, it has been fun to see my kid evolve in her relationship with these sorts of things, where it was like quite passive for a little while, but like we would try to be like, hey, like point out like what's going on. And now she's like locked in. She's like, oh, this Daniel Tiger is in a real pickle on this one. Yeah, so I could imagine that having, it's not a clear answer, right? It's not like one thing or the other. Okay, I thought maybe there was another thing I was going to say about that before we pivot, but I'm going to go ahead and just pivot, which is that maybe to make it slightly less personal, I expect. This work has taken you in new directions, I know. So could you sort of outline for me like where you have departed this focus on children's television without really losing the core elements of what that is?
Yeah, so my recent research to what sounds like a complete 180 has actually started to focus on terrorist-created media and violent extremists, the media that they consume and that they produce. And so it's always a funny thing to bring this up because people think, how do you research kids media and terrorist media? Those are not the same thing. But I'll tell you how I got there. So during my dissertation work, we were trying to craft stimuli that 5 different versions of a graphic novel for kids that we were going to have them read in an experiment. And one graphic novel was going to focus on the importance of being caring to other people. One was going to focus on the importance of being fair, being loyal, being respecting authority, and so on, all the way down the line. And what we've learned, or what I had this kind of epiphany while we were creating this stimuli, is that we were really trying to create a story that really nailed down one moral value and just like drove it home and only focused on that. And so there were a couple pages in the graphic novel that we were creating where we would say things like, for instance, in the authority version of the comic book, we would say things like, you must obey your leaders no matter what the cost is. Even if you think that what they're saying is wrong, you must obey them. And in the loyalty version, we would say things like, you have to side with your group no matter what. Even if you think that that is wrong, you should still side with your group. And we were like, wait a minute. This sounds a little bit authoritarian, doesn't it? And doesn't this kind of how political extremism works, right? Like people kind of drive home this one moral value and that's it. So this led us to believe that it would be kind of interesting to see to what extent moral values are imbued in terrorist-created media. And so one of the studies that we have under review right now did just that. So we applied the same content analytic scheme to a sample of terrorist propaganda that we created to look to see to what extent do terrorists use these moral appeals to persuade people to do bad things, because this has always been the question, right? If I'm going to be violent, how do I persuade you to be violent with me? And so we thought maybe morality is a key here. And so we drew a lot on Linda Skitka's work in moral conviction and all the other work talking about virtuous violence as well. And we looked to see also, Andy, some of your work too, for the moral matching, right? Where we were looking at, do left-wing groups, for instance, tend to appeal to care and fairness? Do right-wing terrorist groups tend to appeal to, more often to loyalty, authority, purity, or, at least more than liberals? And we find that they do. So there is this moral matching effect. This content is extremely well created. And in general, it does the exact same thing that we would see in entertainment media, where it's trying to target its audience and change their behavior, but it's really driving home one moral value, and that's it. And trying to kind of strengthen this moral conviction, to bring in that language as well. And so we've done some work looking at the content side, and we're also looking at the effects to see when that moral matching occurs versus like a moral mismatch. Is it the case that you're less persuaded? And we find, this isn't published yet either, but we find, yeah, it is. The moral matching effect works in political extremist media as well.
Wow. So one of the things that I flagged when you were describing the graphic novel rhetoric that you were trying to work on was the "you must" kind of dogmatic approach, right? Which just reactance alarm bells go off for me, right? Like that strikes me as the kind of rhetoric that is not particularly likely to be persuasive because it's so heavy-handed, right? So listeners of the show will recall earlier this year, we talked to Ben Rosenberg about reactance and how when it feels like a message is trying to tell you what to think, people will either not be persuaded or even go the opposite direction. So what I'm curious about is how much is that a feature of this kind of messaging that you're finding? And why isn't it alienating? Is it like this context makes it reasonable, or what's the deal?
I think both. I think, yes, the context makes it more reasonable, because if you're already sort of in the mindset of, ending up on a terrorist website or ending up, reading a terrorist pamphlet that you don't throw away immediately, you're probably already kind of sort of more likely to agree with the general message. So for instance, the one example that we always give is there's this really, I think they're still active terrorist group called the Minutemen. And they were sort of like a border security group that kind of hung out near the Texas border. And there was this vigilante group that was going to watch the border and basically harm migrants that tried to cross illegally. And they tended to take and exploit sort of these pro-American terms, things like "let's roll," which we all know is kind of famous from the victims of Flight 93 on September 11th, when they tried to kind of take back the plane from the hijackers. They use terms like that. They use terms that are connoted to be sort of pro-American. And so when you first enter that website, you think, well, this isn't so bad, right? Like they're pro-American. Left-wing groups do this too. We care about the environment. We'll do anything to save the environment. We must do anything to save the environment. But then there's usually sort of a twist at the end that they'll say, like, here's specifically how you might do this. Other groups don't give you that twist at all. And they simply say, like, attend this rally to hear more about it. And then they probably give you the switch. But propaganda is propaganda for a reason, right? It's a lot of euphemistic language. It's a lot of stuff that's trying not to give you reactance to their message. Another example is with the Army of God. They're an anti-abortion group. They tend to show you images of aborted fetuses and these really graphic images that are supposed to give you reactance to their cause, right? So that you're sort of on their side then. But again, I also think that the moral matching effect plays a role in here, because if you already agree with the basic premise of the value, that our borders must be secure, that loyalty is important above all else, or that care for unborn fetuses is important above all else, well, you're probably less likely to be reactant to whatever message they're giving you. But I think you would be likely to react, and we have found this in some work too. Reactance is very high if you don't value that moral value at all. So if you think of, for instance, even immigration as a human rights issue rather than a loyalty issue, when you read Minutemen propaganda, you're like, absolutely not. Psychological reactance is super high.
Yeah, and it almost like what is morality if not the kind of thing that you say, well, this is about what we must do. So there's a match not between the audience and the message, but between elements of the message, right? Say, this is a coherent message because you're telling me that it's morally right, and you're telling me that we have to do it. I go, well, all that locks in place for me. Whereas, maybe for other kind of rhetoric where you go like, you're going to save so much money, you have to do it. You go, what are you talking about? I don't have to do anything. Maybe within moral arguments that resonate with my worldview, this kind of authoritarian style kind of is in its sweet spot. Like that's where it can do the work, regrettably, in this case.
Exactly, because we think too that the types of people that this type of propaganda is most likely to be effective on, it's not people who have just sort of been like, political activism curious. It's people who have been sort of exposed to this type of content for a long time. Lots of anti-immigration propaganda, lots of anti-abortion propaganda, for instance. And so by the time they reach an actual violent group, and decide to actually be violent with that group and join or act on behalf of them, they're usually kind of already on the same page as the group. It's just they haven't necessarily risen to that level of violence yet.
And what sorts of messages are these? Like, where do they live? Like, where are you going to find this rhetoric in action?
Yeah, so everywhere. We've looked a lot on old 4chan posts and 8chan posts, but for some of the older terrorist groups, the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but it's kind of like a archive of every website that was ever created. Which is really useful. And so if you knew a terrorist website existed at one time, for instance, before it was taken down, you could look up on the Internet Archive kind of where at that website and see kind of like a snapshot of it at a particular date. And we tried to kind of match up groups' content as close to their last attack date as possible. I will say that there's a ton of propaganda out there. So like the Al-Qaeda Inspire magazine is a really popular one that for being talked about in these spaces because it's extremely well produced. And generally you kind of can't find it on the open web, but if you go into like dark web spaces, you can as well. And it also exists on the archives, Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. There's been one recent white paper that I saw that talked about trying to quantify how much terrorist propaganda and how much terrorist content, so like weapons making instructions exist on the Internet Archive, and the answer is a lot. And so it's tough. It's out there, unfortunately, and fortunately for us, I guess.
Yeah, this does seem wildly different than sitting down watching 3 episodes of Bluey and seeing who's being nice to each other.
Yeah, and I will say that we've taken extreme efforts to try to make sure ensure the safety of our the people who are coding this stuff as well, because a lot of it's really dark. I mean, it is very dark, but I will say a large proportion of it is not dark at all, because again, it's this euphemistic language that terrorists are using to try to justify their cause. So they're, I'm not going to persuade you to join me if I tell you that I'm killing innocent people. I will persuade you if I frame my goals as something a little bit more righteous. So most of it, I think, was sort of passes the eyeball test of not being too harmful. But again, you still also realize that you're reading stuff from actual violent groups who have actually killed people. And we've taken tons of steps to make sure that our coders are safe and whatnot in the process.
And it strikes me that also the MIME presumably accounts for this just as well, right? Especially with the political differences that you're showing, like the moral values that are being conveyed in these messages are being reinforced by like what the audiences are responding to, right? Is that so? Does that full cycle that you described an hour ago apply just as well to this?
It does, yeah. And we've made the case that, terrorists, just like entertainment producers, respond to the audience preferences, right? They're creating propaganda that they know has been successful in the past for increasing member numbers, increasing rally numbers, increasing coverage in media and news media, right? They want people to know about what they're doing, and they want to grow their cause. And so they are responding to audience preferences just in the exact same way that entertainment producers do. And we would like to think also that the MIME does a pretty good job of explaining how it is that people get wrapped up into even viewing this media as like an entertainment purpose as well, because they're already sort of consuming, for instance, again, anti-immigration types of content or anti-abortion content that's really driving home the importance of caring for unborn fetuses, or really driving home the importance of loyalty for our borders. And so you're already sort of wrapped up in this sort of spiral, and it's a little bit easier to accept it and to continue selecting media as well. So we do use the MIME in the same context, yes.
Well, from Elmo to Al-Qaeda, this has been a ride. And so it's super interesting. And thanks for taking the time to share it all with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been great. And I'm absolutely going to work that into a next paper title.
Alrighty, that'll do it for another episode of Opinion Science. Thank you so much to Lindsay Hahn for taking the time to talk about her work. As always, check out the episode webpage for links to her stuff and the research we talked about today. You'll also find links to the full Mr. Rogers testimony if you want to be reduced to a puddle of tears. To learn more about this show, you can find your way to opinionsciencepodcast.com, where you'll find all the past episodes, info about the show, ways to kick in a few bucks to help cover the costs of making this thing, and links to the show on all the podcast players. Also, if you haven't already, dear listener, you can easily help the show by leaving a review someplace like Apple Podcasts. I haven't read reviews on the show in a while, so here's a very nice one from a couple months ago. Quote, "The best psychology podcast. It is accessible to those who are not experts while still providing nuanced and thought-provoking examinations of a diverse range of topics. Opinion Science is definitely worth your time, whether you're a professor, graduate student, or just interested in how people think." Wow, that is so nice. If you'd also like to be nice and post a review of your own, well, gosh, I'm not going to stop you. But that's all I've got this time around. I'll see you back here in a couple weeks for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.